Hey there, Tactical Family. I was recently in the middle of California's 10-day waiting period on a firearms purchase, and I was wondering, why are these laws even still around? We've had the federal instant background check system running since '98, or as the kids call it, the late 1900s. So I decided to dig into it. Supporters say that waiting periods prevent impulsive violence and suicide, but when we dig into how these studies were actually done and look at who's pushing these policies, their arguments start to fall apart. We're going to examine whether these laws have any effect, what problems exist with research, how they affect real people, and whether or not they're even constitutional. Also, if you want to dig into all these studies yourself, I'll put links to them down in the description. So where did these laws even come from? Well, waiting periods really took off in the 1970s through the 1990s. The big moment came in 1993 with the Brady Act, which forced waiting periods on the 32 states that didn't already have background check systems in place. This lasted until 1998, when the instant background check system went live. As of 2014, 17 states plus the District of Columbia still had some form of waiting period. Between 1970 and 2014, 44 states had waiting periods at some point. A lot of data and a lot of variation that researchers used to try and prove these laws worked. So what does the research claim? Well, several studies in major journals have looked at whether or not waiting periods work. The biggest one, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, analyzed 45 years of data using a method called difference in differences. They reported a 17% reduction in gun homicides and estimated that states with waiting periods prevented roughly 750 gun homicides annually. Now here's what difference in differences means. You compare how violence changed over time in states that adopted waiting periods versus states that didn't. If the violence dropped more in waiting period states, researchers attributed that extra drop to the law. The logic seems straightforward, but it relies on a critical assumption that both groups of states would have followed the exact same trajectory if the law hadn't been passed. As we'll see, this assumption is pretty questionable. For suicide, newer research found waiting periods linked to about a 5% drop in gun suicides, but only a 2% drop in overall suicides. The theory is that these laws disrupt impulsive attempts by creating a delay during a crisis. But here's what rarely gets discussed. The other studies, including the largest and most rigorous examination of the Brady Act itself, which found no effect on homicides whatsoever, and some studies found that waiting periods increased violence. In 2000, researchers Jens Ludwig and Philip Cook published the definitive Brady Act study in the Journal of the American Medical Association, one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world. And Cook was actually a well-known gun control advocate. And what did they find? And I quote, "Implementation of the Brady Act appears to have been associated with reductions in the firearms suicide rate for persons aged 55 years or older, but not with reductions in homicide rates or overall suicide rates." The federal government ran an actual policy experiment on 32 states, and researchers found zero effect on homicides. In 2003, the CDC's Task Force on Community Preventative Services conducted a systematic review. Their conclusion on waiting periods: insufficient evidence to determine the effectiveness. They found effects on homicide, suicide, assault, robbery, and rape were inconsistent or failed to reach statistical significance. A 2021 study by Emma Friedel on homicides and mass shootings actually found that waiting periods were associated with significant increases in total homicide rates. And for context, she isn't exactly a Second Amendment advocate. Now, remember that PNAS study claiming 17% reduction? Criminologist Gary Kleck pointed out a critical problem. Of the 8 different statistical tests that the authors ran, only one showed any benefit, the gun homicide finding that they highlighted. The other 7 showed nothing. That's not science, that's cherry picking. Kleck also noted they failed to control for educational attainment, crime rates, police resources, and incarceration rates, controls virtually every other researcher uses. Even RAND, which generally supports gun control research, describes evidence as only limited, and notes that 2 studies found waiting periods increased homicides. So what do we have? The definitive Brady Act study found no effect. The CDC found insufficient evidence, and multiple sources found basically no effect. And some sources found an increase in violence. The one study claiming major benefits had serious methodological problems. The research is all over the place, and with most rigorous studies finding no effect. So here's the fundamental issue. States that pass waiting periods aren't random. They're systematically different. States with lower gun ownership, different political cultures, and distinct demographics are more likely to pass these laws. Blue states with historically low gun ownership might have been seeing violence drop faster anyway, maybe because of other policies, economic changes, or demographic shifts. The waiting period could be getting the credit for a decline that would have happened anyway. The studies try to control for poverty rates, income, urbanization, and age, but they left out a lot. Police hiring and spending, incarceration rates, other criminal justice changes, additional gun laws that pass simultaneously, new policing strategies like CompStat, and cultural attitudes about violence. From 1970 to 2014, the American criminal justice system went through massive changes. Mass incarceration rose and fell, the crack epidemic came and went, new policing methods were rolled out. States adopting waiting periods were likely changing multiple policies at once. Separating what the waiting period actually did becomes nearly impossible. Now let's talk about the poverty problem. The anti-gun crowd loves comparing the United States to Western Europe, but we're not starting from the same baseline. The United States has the highest poverty rate among wealthy nations, about 18% versus the OECD average of 11%, and roughly 3 times the Nordic rates. Poverty is one of the strongest predictors of violent crime, correlating with violence far more consistently than gun ownership. When you compare the United States with 18% poverty to Denmark with 5%, you're not doing an apples-to-apples comparison. The violence gap could be driven entirely by economic factors. Evidence for this comes from within America. Vermont has never regulated concealed carry in its history and ranks 15th in gun ownership. Its firearms homicide rate, less than 1 per 100,000. New Hampshire has the lowest firearms homicide rate in the country at 0.9. Essentially the same as Western Europe, despite ranking 26th in gun ownership. Maine, with the 17th highest ownership rate, also rates around 1 per 100,000. Now, these aren't flukes. All 3 New England states consistently rank among the lowest, despite having extremely permissive gun laws. Now, what do they share? Low poverty, strong safety nets, good education, economic stability. Meanwhile, states with strict gun laws like Maryland and Illinois have extremely high homicide rates, concentrated in cities with high poverty, inequality, and essentially segregation. The waiting period research suffers from this exact problem. Blue states that adopt waiting periods tend to be wealthier. Red states that don't often have higher poverty. The apparent effect of waiting periods could actually be the effect of the types of states that pass them. For suicide, the picture is messy. The reduction in total suicides was smaller and less consistent than the reduction in gun suicides, with some models showing people switching methods. Are these policies preventing deaths or just changing how people die? International evidence raises a bigger question. Japan and South Korea have extremely strict gun control. Private ownership is essentially prohibited, yet both have suicide rates significantly higher than the United States. South Korea's is more than double ours. Switzerland, with extremely high gun ownership rates, has an extremely low suicide rate. This doesn't prove gun laws are irrelevant to suicide, but it strongly suggests cultural factors, mental health systems, and social support matters a lot more than firearms availability. Now, understanding the political motivations and who pushes these policies also matters. Michael Bloomberg, for instance, one of the main funders for Everytown and Moms Demand Action, has said publicly he sees very little legitimate reason for widespread private gun ownership, especially handguns. The Brady campaign started out as the National Council to Control Handguns, with early leadership openly stating that handgun prohibition was the long-term goal, with incremental restrictions as steps to get there. Gun control in America has a documented history of targeting disfavored groups as well. After the Civil War, black codes disarmed freed slaves. California's Mulford Act specifically targeted the Black Panthers. Early 1900s laws like New York's Sullivan Act targeted immigrants. May issue permits gave officials discretion routinely used along racial and class lines. This pattern shows gun control often serves as a tool for restricting rights of groups that those in power don't particularly like. And now some might say, it's just a 10-day wait, what's the big deal? Well, waiting periods create real burdens that are usually ignored. For people in rural areas, these laws mean 2 separate trips: transportation costs, lost time, and forcing people to shop locally instead of finding better prices, as well as hardship for those with inflexible schedules or unreliable transportation. These burdens fall hardest on people who might need self-defense the most: Rural residents where police are far away, and people in dangerous urban neighborhoods, and often those with limited resources. And now, here's perhaps the clearest evidence these laws really aren't about public safety anymore. They apply to people who already own firearms. The rationale is disrupting impulsive suicides, cooling off crimes of passion, and completing background checks. But if you already own guns, none of this really applies. Someone suicidal can use guns they already have. Someone who's all of a sudden pissed off can just use the guns they already have. Background checks were already done. Many states apply waiting periods to every purchase regardless of existing ownership. When laws don't match their stated purpose, you have to question the real goal. The most straightforward explanation is that making gun ownership more difficult generally is the goal, not addressing specific harms. For people facing immediate threats, stalking victims, those receiving credible death threats, waiting periods prevent timely access to protection. This represents a real trade-off, and given the shaky evidence for effectiveness, it's weighted heavily towards restriction rather than protection. We also have the constitutional question. The Supreme Court's Bruin decision established that gun regulations must be consistent with America's historical traditions. Waiting periods are a modern invention with little historical precedent from the founding era. Historical regulations typically focused on categorical prohibitions for certain people or certain places, not time delays for lawful buyers. Lower courts are still working out how to apply this test, with several waiting period laws currently being challenged. Legal experts are split on whether or not these laws can pass the historical tradition requirement. So the research on waiting periods doesn't just have methodological problems, it's genuinely contradictory. The definitive Brady Act study found no effect. The CDC found insufficient evidence. Friedel found increased homicides. The Lucas study, claiming benefits, has been critiqued for selective reporting and omitting standard controls. And Rand describes the evidence as only limited. This uncertainty matters. When evidence is truly uncertain, policies restricting constitutional rights face a higher bar. The precautionary principle works both ways. We must consider not only potential harms from too little regulation, but also harms from excessive regulation and denial of self-defense. Applying waiting periods to existing owners is clear evidence that public safety isn't the main objective. This design choice can't be justified by any mechanism for how waiting periods are supposed to work. Combine that with the documented prohibitionist goals of major anti-gun advocacy organizations, a pattern starts to emerge. These policies serve as stepping stones towards broader restrictions rather than evidence-based interventions. The Second Amendment protects an individual right. Regulations must meet appropriate standards. Under Bruin, this requires consistency with historical tradition. Waiting periods fail this standard. Uncertain evidence, not narrowly tailored, real burdens on lawful citizens, potential denial of timely self-defense, and no clear historical precedent. Instead of evidence-based interventions targeting proven harms, we see policies mainly making gun ownership harder. The methodological limitations rarely get acknowledged. This impact on law-abiding citizens gets completely dismissed. The constitutional questions get treated as obstacles rather than legitimate constraints. The assumption that restricting gun access for law-abiding citizens produces net public safety benefits remains completely unproven. Meanwhile, the costs are real. Denial of self-defense, constitutional erosion, and barriers that disproportionately affect disadvantaged populations. The goal should be evidence-based policies respecting constitutional rights while addressing genuine safety concerns. Waiting periods, especially applied to existing gun owners, completely fails this. A more honest debate would acknowledge uncertainty, respect constitutional constraints, and design interventions targeting specifically stated objectives. And recognize that the question isn't whether we can impose restrictions, but whether those proposed restrictions are justified by any solid evidence or constitutional principle. By that standard, waiting periods cannot be sustained. Anyways, thanks for watching. If you found my videos helpful or informative, consider checking out my Patreon. The link is on my channel page. Every tier gets you into the Discord server, and I'm chronically online and always happy to talk about guns, gear, and gun rights. As always, I've been the 2A Tactical Dad, and as I like to say, we could all be a little more free and a lot more self-reliant. All it takes is a little responsibility. Also, guys, when it's your, well, let's just say it's not your first firearm, these laws start to feel a little personal.